Welcome to our series on mobile programming, where we are going to focus on the process of creating software applications which are able to run on our mobile devices. For example, our smartphones and our tablets. We will be using the tool React Native, and this is a cross-platform tool. What it does is it allows us to write a single code base that can then be deployed on multiple platforms. For example, it can be deployed on Android or it can be deployed on iOS with just a single code base, meaning we don't have to make any changes to the code. We just deploy and it works on these different platforms. But before we get there are some core elements, some background work that we need to understand, that we need to appreciate, so that we can have a strong foundation in terms of building these mobile applications. And first on the table is to understand the concept of HTML. Whenever we are talking about mobile applications, typically what we are saying is that it's the browser that is going to be displaying the images, the text, and so on, which make up a part of our application. And HTML, hypertext markup language, is the predominant language that governs all of this. In other words, it comes with some built-in elements. We call these elements tags. And these tags provides us with a way in which we can structure our content. So we have some of the common tags which are highlighted. For example, the head tag, the body tag, the heading tags, and that's from H1 to H6. The input tag, the button tag. So these are some of the core tags that we will be experimenting with in the early phases of this particular module. Another thing that is important is to be able to style these elements. In other words, when we create these HTML elements, we want to determine the kind of look and feel. And there is a section in mobile programming that talks about cascading style sheets. And whenever we hear about cascading style sheets, what we are talking about is the set of commands that allow us to determine the appearance of the elements. In other words, what kind of color are we seeing? How are these elements spaced out on the page? What kind of fonts are we using? So we are going to be using a combination, therefore, of both HTML and CSS in order to get the kind of look and feel that we need in terms of our mobile application. Now, the mobile application is not going to be complete without an understanding of an event handler. In other words, our users will need to interact with these applications. And they interact with these applications by generating events. For example, you can click on a button. When you click on the button, you are generating a click event. And this click event needs to be handled. In other words, the programmer needs to determine what should happen whenever this event, this click event, is generated. So the concept of an event handler becomes important because an event handler is some operation, some function that the programmer is going to set up. And this function will execute whenever a particular event has been triggered. So throughout this module, throughout this series, we will be looking at creating our user interface elements. We will be looking at styling these user interface elements. And we'll also be looking at handling the various events that allows these interfaces to be able to interact properly with our users. Now let's quickly look at an example just to get a deeper appreciation of HTML and how things are structured. And in this diagram, we are actually seeing an example of a typical HTML document. I will go over into a simulation tool called EduBlocks, and we will use it to construct this basic HTML page, HTML document. And as we do that, we will experiment with a few of the HTML tags and get a deeper appreciation of what they bring to the table. So I'm opening up a new tab, and I'm going to go to app.edublocks.org. And we need to choose the HTML option. And we are choosing the text-only option. And then we hit on the Create button. Now, if you notice, what we are doing here is we are interacting with a user interface. So I'm going to click on the button, and I expect something to happen. And there we go. We are now inside our application. So the first thing that we saw was the use of the doc type. And it said that the doc type is HTML. So looking at the top line, doc type, HTML, that it is placed in angle brackets, and it begins with a exclamation sign. So we have gotten that syntax correctly. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to use a tag known as the HTML tag. Now, tags are predefined within the HTML language. And this HTML tag tells us that we are creating an HTML document. So this is where we begin to structure the HTML document. Now, you will find that there are two types of tags. We have container tags, and we have self-closing tags. The container tags are, as the name suggests, they can contain other elements or other tags. Whereas the self-closing tags do not contain any other tags. The other thing to bear in mind is that our containers create a nested hierarchy. In other words, when we look within the tags, we can know who are the children of the tag, who are the grandchildren of the tag, and so on, just by how deeply nested these elements are. And as we progress, we'll kind of demonstrate exactly what we mean by that. Now, within the HTML tag, there are two tags which are usually placed to give us structure. The first one being the head tag, and the second one being the body tag. Another thing to note is that whenever we talk about these container tags, they have a starting tag and they have an ending tag. So if we look at HTML, it has a starting tag, which is HTML, surrounded by the angle brackets. And if we look at the end, we realize that it also has a closing tag, which is HTML preceded by the // and that is also wrapped into the angle brackets. And if we look at the head and the body, you will realize that those are also examples of container tags. So the body will be containing some stuff. We'll talk about those stuff later. And the head can also contain stuff. So let's break down all of this. Inside the body is where we typically put the elements that we want to display on the screen. For example, I could want a label. And this label allows us to display text onto the screen. So let's say, for example, username. We typically indent to show the hierarchy within a container tag. For example, we have indented label because label is inside the body tag. If you have a look at our display screen, you are seeing that we have some information that is now shown. We're actually displaying the username. So this is the label in action. Now, we typically use labels so that we can add context to our user interface. And what this means is that it gives us additional information about controls that we are going to see on the screen. For example, I might want to associate this particular label with a text box. And in order to create the text box, we're going to make use of the input tag. And the input tag is an example of one of those self-closing tags. Now notice that our user interface has changed. We now have our label followed by our text box. And this tells us that inside of this text box, we expect to see a username. So that's the kind of context that the label gives to the text box element. We usually have the type attribute whenever we're talking about an input box. And the purpose of the type attribute is to decide what kind of input element we're looking at. The default is going to be text. So if I type text here, then you realize that nothing has changed. But let's say, for example, I type button. Then notice that the physical appearance has changed. We now have a button that I can click on instead of the text box. We can also change this to what is called a radio button. And if you have a look, you realize that we now have a different visual appearance. This is now a rounded button, which is known as the radio button. So the key point here is that by making use of the type attribute, we can change the type of or the kind of input element that we are looking at. The other type of input element that is going to be useful is called a checkbox. And we have the checkbox displayed over here. And notice we can interact with it. And that is why these are known as input elements, because we can interact with them. So we can select the checkbox or deselect it. For the radio, we can do a similar thing. We can select it. and deselect it once we customize it properly. For the text box, we can type inside of it. So we have created our label. We have created our input box. And note, whenever I click on the input box, it becomes active, which means we can begin to type. Normally, what we want to do is we want to link our label to our text box so that if we click on the label, or I'm clicking on the label, and notice that the box is not activating, but we want to be able to click on the label and have the box be activated at the same time. To do that, we need to give the input box an ID value. So use the ID attribute, and let's call it name box. We then need to link the label to the input box. And we do that by using the for keyword equal, and then we specify the label of the input box that we want to type to, which in this case is name box. And now, when we click on the label, notice that the box becomes selected, and we can type in there right away. So what we're doing in this demonstration is we are setting up the basic structure of our HTML document, and we are interacting with the various elements, the various tags that we have at our disposal. The final thing I'm going to be adding to this HTML document is going to be a button. And notice the button tag is also a container tag. We're going to determine what we want to see being displayed on the button. And I want click me. Let's have a look at the preview window and see how it is changing as I do the typing. And what I want to do ideally is whenever I click on the button, I want some text to appear inside the text box. Right now, it is not wired up to do that. And so what we need to do is to introduce the concept of an event handler. In other words, we want to create some operation, some function that will run, that will execute whenever the user clicks on the button. Or to put it another way, whenever the button receives a click event, we want to execute a particular set of code. And in this case, there is an event handler called onClick. It's an attribute as well, but it's an event attribute. And we are going to assign to it the kind of operation that we want to perform. Let me first of all just do an alert. And the purpose of this alert is to bring up a message box that will display some sort of message. So in this case, I'm simply saying, whenever the button is clicked, I want to display a message box with the word welcome. So let's try that out. So I'm going to hit click me. And notice we have our box that has been generated. And inside the box, we're actually seeing the welcome message as we intend. So what we have done right here is we have generated our first event. And we have handled that event so that whenever the event is generated, we can display the welcome message on the screen. What we are trying to do, however, is to do a bit more than this. We want, whenever we click on the button, we display a message inside the text box. In other words, we want to create some relationship, some interactivity or interaction between the various elements that we are using within our application. And so we are now going to have a look at how we can get that to work. In order to fully understand this section, however, it might be useful to have a look at what happens in the background whenever an HTML document is created. There is some internal structure known as the DOM that is created whenever we create an HTML document. And DOM stands for Document Object Model. And it says here that the DOM is central whenever we're talking about these mobile web apps because HTML elements are structured as nodes. And these nodes are manipulated via JavaScript. If you have a look over here, you will realize that we have created a representation of a DOM tree. So document is the root of the tree. And inside that, or attached to that document, we have the HTML element. And inside the HTML element, we have two children, one being head and one being body. And inside the body has a child called div, which means that div is actually the grandchild of HTML. So the parent of div is body. And div has some children, one being a paragraph tag, one being a header tag, and one being a list tag. This is known as an unordered list. And this tree that we're having a look at was actually generated by this HTML document. So what we're saying here is that your DOM tree is created automatically based on the elements that you place within your HTML document. Now, going back to the concept of JavaScript, JavaScript allows us to be able to target any element within the DOM tree and be able to access that element. And it's that concept that we're going to be using as we attempt to get our application to work as we want it to work. Remember, what we are trying to do is to click on the button, and instead of having this alert message being displayed, we want a username to be displayed in the text box. So let's do some modification so we can have that happening. Now, the first thing I'm going to do in terms of tying that together is I'm going to associate the onClick handler to the code that will actually target the DOM elements. And when it targets the DOM element, which in this case is going to be the text box, then I want to place a value inside that text box. I'm going to put this on a new line so that we have a bit more space. And sometimes you'll see things organized in this fashion. And when it's organized in this fashion, it means the same thing as if it were on one line, but it gives us a bit more space that we can work with. All right, so going back to our on-click handler, we want to target the document. So there's a keyword that gives us access to that. The keyword, no surprise, is called document. And there's an operation called get element by ID. By the way, JavaScript is case sensitive, so the way in which we type these commands are going to be important. The element that I want to target is going to be the name box element. It has the ID of name box, so this is the input box. So name box. Notice my spelling. I'm ensuring that I'm giving it the correct spelling in terms of the case that is used. And there is a property associated with this called value. Whenever we talk about value, we are usually talking about the input box and the value that is actually seen, the data that is actually seen inside of this input box. We are going to assign it a value. Let's say in this case, it's going to be Bob. Now, just a quick explanation as to the use of the double quotation and the single quotation. They are both used to represent string values in JavaScript. So in other words, we can use them interchangeably. However, whenever we want to use a string value within a string value, then there has to be a way to distinguish between them. So the convention is if the outer string value is represented by the double quotes, as in this case, so these are the outer strings, then it means that for the inner strings, we need to be using single quotes, as demonstrated by the use of the single quotes for Bob and the single quotes whenever we are talking about the ID that we are targeting. All right, so we have the code that we want. So we can now test to see if we're going to get the kind of output that we anticipate. So notice I clicked on the button and the value Bob has been displayed inside of the text box. So we are now interacting between the different elements which are in our application. Let's now talk a little bit about styling, about CSS. As was mentioned earlier, we can use the concept of CSS to apply some styles to our user interface. Right now, the user interface looks pretty bland. There are no colors. And so we can make use of the concept of the CSS style to kind of jazz up things a bit. In order to do this, we are going to make use of a particular package that makes our life simpler. And the package is known as Tailwind CSS. So we are going to include the particular package and we are going to make use of it. In order to do this, we are going to make use of a script tag. And we're going to place that script tag for this example inside the head. The script. And for the source, because the script tag has an attribute called source, we're going to make that equal to https:// And then we're going to point it to the online Tailwind CSS package. So that's CDN, which means Content Developer Network, dot Tailwind CSS.com. Now, notice if you look at our window, our text box has disappeared. And it has disappeared because just by including the Tailwind CSS package, we have removed all previous styling that might have been present there by the browser. And this now allows us to determine the kind of styling that we want as the developers. Just to be consistent, I'm going to indent the script tag because it's actually a child of the head tag. All right, great. So let's now do a bit of styling. So I'm going to start with the input box. And whenever we are doing styling, we use the class keyword in HTML. When we go over to our JavaScript application, to our React application, then we look at how to do things slightly differently on that platform. So it's class equal, we put our string, and within our string, we can then start to define some of the styling elements. So I can say, for example, background, give it a color, let's say blue, and we then determine the intensity, let's say 200. And just by doing that, you realize that we are now seeing back our text box element being displayed. So it's being displayed as a little blue box because we have set the background color to blue and we have set the intensity to a light shade of blue, 200. If we increase, let's say to 500, then notice that the color becomes more vibrant. So let me leave it at 300. And what I've just done is I've just styled the text box by making use of the Tailwind CSS class called BG Blue 300, which stands for, as I said before, background color being blue with a color intensity of 300. Another thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to place a color on the body tag. Remember, the body is a container. So class equal, let's say for the background, we are using orange, and let's say that orange is 100. Now, I want you to notice that the body tag takes up the entire screen. So the body tag represents the container that maps to the entire screen. If we resize, notice that as far as we are going, as big as it's getting, we are seeing the light orange color being displayed. So it's taking up the entire screen. All right, let me try and get back my text window without having to exit this program. And it does give a bit of trouble sometimes, but it's useful for our demonstration purpose. All right, so I think we should be good now. So let's get back to what we were doing. Whenever we create our components for our screen or mobile devices, for example, we usually want them to be contained in smaller containers. We don't want to place them directly inside the body. So there's a tag that we typically use for that, and this tag is called the div tag. As you can see, it's a container tag. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the elements that we had and we're going to place them inside of that div tag. Once again, we keep on doing our tabs just so that we can have the visual appearance of where the parent is and where the children are. So we have created a container inside the body container. And then we are now going to have a look at how can we now size this container so that we're not taking up the entire screen as we would take up whenever we are actually using the body container. So that's what we're going to have a look at now. So let's begin by giving our container width. Remember, we're using Tailwind CSS to do all of our styling. And let's set the width to be about 500 pixels. And then we will see if that is going to be appropriate. So we set the width to 500 pixels, but we also need to select a background color so that you can see the implications of that width. So let's say background color red, and let's say 100. Now, you should be seeing a faint red line or red section, but let me bump it up a little bit more. So now you're seeing that we have created a boundary box that has a width of 500 pixels. And it captures the elements that we want. Now, I think 500 pixels might be a bit too much. So let me cut it down a bit. Let me try 400. All right, I think we can go down even further. So let's go to 300. Well, 300 is too small, as you can see here. It causes the items to wrap within the container. So let's go to 350. And 350 seems to be perfect. Now, in terms of spacing, you will want to understand or appreciate the difference between what a margin is, what it does, and what a padding is, and what it does. So we're going to make those slight adjustments and see what changes in terms of the visual. So please bear in mind that the div is actually a child of the body. And one of the things that I would want to do is to kind of make some distinction between the div and the body. So I want to create some margins between them. And what the margins do is it spaces out elements within the container. So let me go here and let me choose margin. So margin is M. And let me give it some space. Let's say 4. And then we'll have a look at what that does. So by giving it 4, you realize that it gives me some space both at the top and at the side. So what margin does by default, it gives the spacing all around the container. So I have the div container and I'm putting space all around it. I could also have targeted the space based on its axis, whether or not it's on the x-axis or the y-axis. So let us change this from all around, and let's say we just want to space it out on the x-axis. So on the x-axis, notice it just shifts it on the x-axis. So there's no space on the y-axis. I'm going to take it off just to show you. So right now, there's no space anywhere. I want to move this container on the x-axis, which runs this way from left to right. So I'm targeting the margin on the x-axis and I'm putting on spaces of 4. And you can see that it has now moved from left to right. I could also have done something similar in terms of the y-axis. So this means that I would type my, I would give it the spacing, which in this case would be 4. And now notice it moves downwards. It moves along the y-axis. Going back to where we were, where we have it all around, we have created some separation right here. Let us now talk about padding. So whereas the margins target the area around the container, the padding targets the area inside the container. So I'm going to put some padding. I'm going to put the padding all around, and let's say that the padding is 6. Now notice what has happened. The elements have been spaced out both vertically and horizontally. And because there's no more space in the container, then it wraps it around. So let's decrease until we find something that is appropriate. So when I put the padding of 2 all around, notice that we get a bit of space on the inside of the container. I'm now going to style the button. Let's say class equal, and let's give the button a background color of, let's say, green. Let's give it the green more intensity. So let's say about 500. Let's create some padding. So let's say padding of 1. And let's say we want the button to be rounded. So notice that there is a slight roundness at the edges. And let's now test to see if this still works. So I'm going to click me, and we see Bob being displayed. Now I want Bob to be centered. So I'm going to go back to the input box. And I'm going to type text centered or center, which is also another Tailwind CSS option that we can use. And notice when I click, it now put Bob in the center of the text box. I want to add a bit more styling to the input box. So I'm going to carry down the other attributes so I get a bit more space. And what I want to do now is to change the text color to white. So instead of it being black, I want it to be white. And there we go. So this demonstration has kind of set the stage in terms of where we are going to go as we build our mobile applications. We have, first of all, looked at things through the lens of HTML and CSS, which is the foundational background knowledge that you need to understand what is going to happen as we build out our mobile applications using React Native. But before we move to React Native, there is a precursor known as React that allows us to write mobile applications in this with this tool set that precedes React Native. And this tool set is called React. So we are going to spend a bit of time in our next session having a look at React, comparing the similarities between React and HTML. We will still be using Tailwind CSS for our styling because, as I mentioned, it provides us with an easy way of doing the styling by making use of that package. And then we'll also look at the ways in which the React platform is going to be different from how we do things on the HTML platform. So I encourage you to take some time to go back through all the concepts that I have just demonstrated, because a proper understanding of these concepts are going to be important for you to leverage your understanding of the React platform. So see you in the next session. Take care.